And I am just super happy to have Kim with us tonight to talk about On Heaven's Hill. Kim first came to Alaska in 1979 as a ranger with the National Park Service, and he's a freelance writer and has been for 40 years, authoring more than a dozen books, and 5 of them were published by National Geographic. For tonight, a couple of housekeeping items. Participants are going to be muted for the duration of the program, and we're going to try to field questions during the show. So feel free to type in questions throughout the program, but we might save them for the end so that Kim can answer them during the Q&A. If for any reason you missed tonight's program, we are being recorded, and so we'll send out the recording shortly. So with that, I'm super pleased to turn this presentation over to Kim, and he's going to share more about his experience using story to protect wild places, especially in Alaska. And Kim, do you want to chat with us for around 30 minutes?
Okay, very good. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, everybody, for joining my presentation tonight. And thank you for supporting the Alaska Wilderness League and for your keen interest in all things Alaskan. That's an honor to spend the evening with you, that you would give me an hour of your time to basically listen to stories. I'm a firm believer that stories can save the world, that we all come from a long line of storytellers, and that you can reach people of a very different persuasion by telling a story. How many of you have ever said to a child or a grandchild, "Come over here, sweetie, and sit next to me and let me read you some bedtime statistics"? Statistics are a great tool. They perform a valuable function in our world today, but it's not what we're made of. Whereas story, to listen to a story from grandpa or your uncle on your mother's side, if we go back in time, I think about the Koyukon people of Alaska, of interior Alaska. I think about Make Prayers to the Raven, a wonderful book written by the anthropologist Richard K. Nelson, all about living with the Koyukon people. And he would talk about how the kid's uncle or their grandpa, when all the hunting was done and all the meat was in and the berries were picked, it's getting cold. It's October, late October, maybe November. And they would snuggle in for the night, the kids, 6, 8, and 10 years old, and grandpa would start reading. He wouldn't start reading, he'd start telling them a story. They had no written language. And this story would be very compelling, maybe about a wounded beaver, a beaver that was out before it was wounded, gathering wood, but was caught by a wolf, but escaped remarkably because a raven startled the wolf and let the beaver go. And the beaver got on the water before it froze up and the wolf couldn't get it back. So now it's a wounded beaver. And wounded beaver is in the lodge now. And grandpa tells the story of wounded beaver, and the kids are all listening, and they're tucked in and they're starting to get sleepy. And the story lasts for maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes. And grandpa ends the story with some suspense. And the next morning, the kids want to know what's going to happen. He'd say, wait for the story that night. And he would continue the story that night. And that's the way it would go for 7 months. And in the telling of that story, everything had a spirit. Everything was interconnected. Everything had value. Everything, the entire living world was a community, not just the people, but everything. The lichens, caribou, the blueberries, the moss, the birch trees, and especially the ravens that created the world. So I didn't really tap into this, the power of story, until much later in my life. I grew up with an older brother who was a math whiz, and he got work with NASA, worked in Houston and Maryland at the Goddard Space Center. And I thought, I want to be a scientist too. So I got 2 degrees in school in science and thought, yes, science, there's a beauty to science. There really is. It's the objective truth, to test something and test it again and again. I loved that about science. And for many years, I pursued a career in science. But I remember in the election of 1980, when Ronald Reagan defeated President Jimmy Carter in early November of that year, about 1 month before Carter would sign the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act that created a massive amount of acreage of new national parks, wildlife refuges, and wild and scenic rivers, monuments and preserves, etc., in Alaska. Gates of the Arctic National Park, Kenai Fjords National Park, Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, just phenomenal. So all these new lands created by Jimmy Carter, and there had been a study done, a scientific study on the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge about the effects of oil drilling on the porcupine caribou herd of far northeast Alaska. And when the Reagan administration came in, replacing the Carter administration in early 1981, they just rewrote the conclusion to the study. They didn't change any of the data. They just rewrote the conclusion and said, well, there'd be no problems to the caribou and other wildlife drilling for oil 100 miles east of Prudhoe Bay here in the 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I thought, wow. So you could spend all that time in the field gathering all that data, and people just come along and rewrite the conclusion. So I thought, I'm going to be a writer. I want to raise my voice. A friend of mine, Zach Brown, has been working on a memoir. He founded Tidelines Institute. He's a PhD climate activist out of Stanford University. And he was doing research in Arctic Norway and Svalbard several years ago, and they were reaching deep into the talus slopes, these rocky slopes, pulling out these little dovekies, these little seabirds that nest high up in Arctic Norway. They're seabirds. And he said to one of his fellow students, why are we measuring these birds? Why are we measuring their wingspans and their body mass index and all of that? He said, the fellow student said, well, we need to know. We need this information because we know that the ocean is changing and we need to know what's happening to these birds. And Zach said, we know what's happening to the birds. We know where the problem is with the burning of fossil fuels, much of which this carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean, as well as the heat. And so the oceans get warmer and more acidic. Zach thought we need more activism, not more science. Or maybe we always need more science, but we need a lot more activism. So I became an activist writer. I wrote a lot of nonfiction, but a while back, I moved into writing novels because really, if you think about it, everybody, think about some of the most profound and powerful books in human history, the ones that have really changed things, really shaken people's cages. And it's fiction. It's novels. It's Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I mean, when the 1850s Fugitive Slave Act hit and was passed by Congress, signed into law, it really angered people in the northern states that bounty hunters could come north, capture these slaves and take them back south. Nobody could stop them. Well, then Harriet Beecher Stowe comes along and writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she does what no writer before then had ever done. She put the readers everywhere in the shoes of a slave, and in other characters too. So that's the beauty of fiction, is you walk in the shoes of others. It's really good for creating empathy, to grow empathy, to expand your heart and your hope and your imagination. Think about The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, or To Kill a Mockingbird, right? These books, Catch-22, that use some humor to talk maybe about the folly of the military mindset. I mean, I don't disrespect the military. All my family's been in the military. But I think what Joseph Heller was saying in Catch-22, he was making some important points that the military itself could learn from and improve from. So many years ago, I wrote a novel called Jimmy Bluefeather. It took me 12 years to write it and revise it. It came out in 2015. about an old canoe carver and his grandson. And in the wake of that, I started thinking about veterans and about war, that war is so outrageous, contrasting that with love. And then backdropping that all with the healing power of the natural world. So I created a story in On Heaven's Hill, where it just came out a little more than a month ago, where I have a preteen girl. Her name is Kess, which is short for Kestrel. She's named after a falcon because her papa loves birds. And her papa's a musician. And he has his own band and his own recording contract and a bus. They travel from concerts. They open up for bigger names than they are, but he doesn't have a lot of money. Musicians often don't have very much money. So his papa, or the girl's grandfather, says, join the National Guard for some extra money. So he does. He gets shipped off to Afghanistan. And his Humvee rolls over an improvised explosive device, and his legs are shattered below the knees. And he's got traumatic brain injury, and he goes mute. Now he goes to a hospital in Germany. Now he's back at the Brooke Army Medical Facility in San Antonio, Texas. And that's where this girl, as the story opens, that's where this girl lives. She's from Texas, but her uncle, her father's older brother, has a commune, or a 20 acres of a sort of an encampment in the little town of Strawberry Flats in Alaska, where there's a bunch of PTSD veterans. And he says, come north. He tells the whole family, come north. It will do wonders for you. Nature is the world's largest healthcare clinic. So should they? The girl is a bit daunted by this, and her mother isn't quite sure if that would be the best thing for her husband. And there's two other points of view in the novel, that of a former trapper from the interior of Alaska who moves back down south to Strawberry Flats because that's the part of Alaska his wife is from. So they say, let's trade the tundra for the tide. So they move back to this magical world of Southeast Alaska, where I live, in the town of Gustavus at the entrance to Glacier Bay, which the little town in the novel, Strawberry Flats, is loosely based off of. So it's best to write from what you know best. And that's what I do in both Jimmy Blue Feather and On Heaven's Hill. I write about my home. I just fictionalize, I take amalgams of people all around me, and I just shape them into my characters, and just my knowledge of the natural world here, the moose and the bears and the wolves howling from across the river right over here, right through the woods from where we live here. I've seen wolves a couple times in my 22 years living here. I've just happened to glance over through the trees and see a line of wolves moving along the river. In the wintertime, when the deciduous trees, mostly the alder, don't have their leaves, and I just caught a glimpse of a wolf, and it just changed everything for me. So what the girl's uncle says to her is, come to Alaska, you'll hear wolves, it'll blow your mind. And it does, it reanimates the girl's father. So the whole novel is about the healing power of big, wild nature and how it helps put us back together again and helps form community. There's almost a warmth we find in the cold, and a closeness that we feel in the distance. It's very paradoxical. It's filled with irony, but it's so true. Just nobody locks a door. Everybody waves as they drive by each other. The roads have terrible potholes in them. You're lucky if you're making 12 miles an hour. You just take a deep breath and slow down. There's a saying in Mexico, bad roads, good people, good roads, too many people. And so that's a bumper sticker that's been adopted in this little town. So if I could back up just for a moment and go back to a book that changed my life after I wrote it. It's a memoir called The Only Kayak, about finding home in Alaska. And so What do you do when you fall in love with a place? When do you hold on and when do you let go? Aren't we all dealing with that as we age and get older, how the places change, how we lose loved ones? It's important for us navigating in our lives, I believe, just to know how to deal with change. I'm sure dealing with that all the time. Uh, Sometimes it's breathtaking to me, and I feel almost paralyzed by it. But other times I think, boy, I'm really lucky. I'm really blessed. Most of my problems, if not all of my problems, are first world problems. So that's a good thing. But in the Only Kayak, toward the end of the prologue, I wrote about coming up to Alaska for what I thought would be one summer, and I guess I just forgot to leave. It's so powerful that it changed all the points of my compass, and it changed my imagination. And how I became a different thinker. I think I became a better thinker. I ended up living in a town with people that see the world very differently than I do. And I learned to get along with them and to listen. And that the whole act, I think, the act of listening is an act of love. And I wanted to explore that in On Heaven's Hill. But I really began to tap into it, I think, as a young ranger, making my new home in Alaska. And I wrote toward the end of the prologue of The Only Kayak, I love this ice-cut coast. I love it for its storm-tossed, salt-bitten manners and its resilience. How it puts on a dress of hemlock and spruce after glaciers have scoured it down to bedrock. I love it for how it sleeps in winter and pulses in summer and invites me to do the same. I love it for the chill of infinity it blows through me. How the rain fills my cup and I drink the sky. I love it the way a kid on a bicycle lets go of those handlebars and throws back his head, riding on faith. I came here for the place, but I stayed for the people. I stayed for the friendships, the warmth we find in the cold, the closeness we feel in the distance. I stayed because my friends stayed, and together we formed a community, a blanket, a family held together by stories about love and loss and risk and hope. That's what the girl's uncle knows and says, I can't even put it into words. It's ineluctable. Just come to Alaska. I really believe it will heal my brother, he says to Kestrel. Cass, it will heal your papa. I really believe that. So they arrive in Alaska, flying up the coast because Kestrel's uncle is a really cool guy. He's a pilot. About once a year, he flies his own Cessna from Alaska down to Texas to see the family, check in on his brother, who's had both his legs amputated below the knees, still is not speaking. Says, I'll fly you all up to Alaska. And then he also, before he does that, he flies mysteriously down to Mexico and back at night. So I wanted to create some mystery in the book. And a lot of music. I use music all the way through, braiding music into the story because Kess's papa is a musician. And I want to braid the brotherhood like a double helix, the brotherhood of a pack of wolves and a pack of veterans. Those two brotherhoods and how the similarities between them. Oftentimes, veterans in different parts of the United States will go spend time with hybrid wolves to help them heal, especially if they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. So they fly up. Kestrel and her papa and her grandpa with Uncle Ty flying the plane. They fly out of Texas through New Mexico. They see the mountain where Aldo Leopold, if any of you know this story about Aldo Leopold, when he was a young forester with the Forest Service back in 1909, he saw a mother wolf and some pups down by a creek, and he and his friends shot their rifles down in the wolves, and they got there in time to see the mother wolf dying with the fierce green fire flickering in her eyes before she died. And he knew then, as a young man, Leopold knew that he would never be the same after witnessing that. So Uncle Tyler tells Kestrel that's the mountain where that happened, back in the Arizona territory, before Arizona and New Mexico became a state. And they continue flying north, up through Idaho, Washington State. They refuel in Bellingham and then fly all the way up the coast. They refuel in Bellingham to avoid Canadian customs and head up the coast. Everything is so green, as if green weren't just a color, but a texture. Kes stares with all her might, determined to miss none of it, the mountains and inlets, the fingers of land and sea that appeared to grasp one another, as if in greeting. Finally, in Alaska, Uncle Ty points out the blue ribbon glaciers and snowy peaks and granite pinnacles and different kinds of fishing boats, seiners, trollers, gill netters. They land in Juneau and stand about, inhaling the cool air. Already, Papa appears to stand more erect, be more alert, more alive. When Kes hugs him, he hugs her back fiercely. Mike, who they picked up along the way, grimaces with pain and talks about the glaciers, how John Muir admired them many years ago and dreamed of softly freezing in them, deep in a crevasse. What a glorious death that would be. Back in Clare, that's the name that Kes has given the plane, the Cessna, for the word clairvoyant, the eye in the sky, which Tyler loves. He says, I've never had a name for my plane. What should we call it, Kes? She thinks for a minute and says, Claire. He goes, why Claire? She goes, clairvoyant, for the eye in the sky. Back in Clare, Mike takes a morphine drip and falls asleep. 30 minutes later, westbound, Claire passes over a beautiful snowy ridge, then drops down, down, down to land in a little town on the edge of everything. Welcome to Strawberry Flats, Uncle Ty says. You can set your watches back 100 years. So they settle in. Every Saturday night, all the veterans gather together and eat moose chili and play poker. And there's a lot of repartee, which I use the humor. I try to lace the whole story with humor because I take on serious issues in this book. I take on American gun culture a little bit, the cruelty to wolves, the climate crisis. And when they begin to hear the wolves across the river, Kestrel's Papa, being a musician, it reverberates in him. And she goes, Papa, are they howling in harmony? Like, is that the root note? And then the flat seventh, is that a third and a fifth? Oh my goodness, they can hear him at a distance from across the river. And in time, the state of Alaska proposes a road right past this encampment where these veterans live. And they call it willy-nillyville because they just build willy-nilly. There's no building codes, there's no covenants, there's no zoning. You just build however you wish. And that's what they do. But it's also warm and welcoming. They have chickens, they have a little rabbit they call Rabbit Downey Jr. They've got 2 Manchurian ponies, Stardust and Golden, after the Joni Mitchell song, Woodstock. They've got an apiary, bees. They've got a huge solar array, a massive garden. So Kes just can't believe it. They got a shop and some of the veterans are magnificent woodworkers. And as they hear these wolves and her Papa comes back to life, and then the threat of this development, this coal bed methane, that the state's going to punch in this road, build a bridge over the river and go out there where the wolves live and where the sandhill cranes stop over every April and September. What happens is Kes rises, becomes something she never imagined she could be in Texas, something of a Greta Thunberg character. And the story becomes something of a Standing Rock mixed in with a Milagro Beanfield type story. And it's a resistance story. And then woven into that are the wolves. About 15% of the book is written from the point of view of a wolf that's within that pack. And that's probably the craziest, most daring thing I do in the book. Another point of view is from a former trapper. So there's 3 points of view, everybody. Silver the wolf, Salt the trapper, and Kes the preteen girl. So the book just every third chapter revisits a character. So it's just Silver, Salt, and Kess, and again, Silver, Salt, and Kess. And you can feel the characters coming together. And I was deeply moved by the 1997 novel Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. If you've read that, you remember that magnificent book. Please read it if you haven't. That there's a Civil War soldier in a field camp, Inman. He has a terrible neck wound. And he just is looking around, seeing the folly of it all. And he just gets up in the middle of the night and leaves, starts walking west toward the mountains. He's in North Carolina, I believe, in eastern North Carolina. He's going to go over the mountains west to be with his sweetheart, Ada. He's had it. So now he's a deserter. So now the home guard is hunting him, and they'll kill him if they find him. So it's a chapter on Inman and a chapter on Ada. Back to Inman, back to Ada. And you just know they're going to come together. And that's what I wanted to create with On Heaven's Hill, was as the characters they begin to encounter each other and make impressions on each other. And that's really fun to finally, when Kess first sees Salt and has an impression of him. And when he first sees her, he just, the former trapper, who's been asked by the state of Alaska that if he would start trapping again to clean out these wolves, because they could be genetically unique. They eat salmon, and which wolves in Southeast Alaska do. That this could be an impediment, these wolves, for the state. The state of Alaska has a long history of vigorously killing wolves. So I don't make a big deal out of it, but I talk about it for sure and set the stage. But I also try to use humor and music to make the story enjoyable. And when I first read Milagro Beanfield War by John Nichols back in the late 1970s, I screamed with laughter. I found the humor in the book so brilliant, and it's a powerful story. The story is addressing many powerful issues, but I just gobbled it down because the humor was so pitch perfect. And that's what I tried to do. And On Heaven's Hill, and I have to tell you, everybody, when I was getting my blurbs from fellow authors, I thought, well, that's good. I'm getting nice praise. But then Mark Adams, who wrote Turn Right at Machu Picchu and Tip of the Iceberg, he ends it by saying, this book will appeal equally to aging idealists reared on Edward Abbey and adventurous kids hooked on Gary Paulson. Oh, and it's laugh out loud funny too. I was so happy to get that review, that somebody recognized the humor in the book. I think it's essential that we share the joy we have with each other, that we celebrate daily, consistently, that we live in such a magnificent world, and that we have humor, we have music in our lives, that we have love and community and all of this. And I really try to tap into that in On Heaven's Hill. And by the end of the book, the community that has been created through all this is something I really wanted to achieve, because I am blessed to have real community where I live. Nobody here locks a door. If you go to the airport, you just leave your keys in the ignition. You fly out. If you come back, your car is gone. They say, oh yeah, Hank and Anya took your car because they came back early from Juneau, and somebody had taken their truck. Paul and Melissa had taken their truck, so they took your car. So there's Jen's car over there. She's going to be gone for a month, so just take her car. So we're all driving around town in somebody else's rig, and then there's a big potluck dinner or a music event somewhere, and we all arrive in somebody else's rig and then end up leaving in our own. But we might put on the wrong pair of rubber boots and go home with those on. So anyway, I have a couple closing little readings I'll share with you at the end of this hour, everybody. But Hillary asked me to go for about 30 minutes, and I have. And I can open it up to Q&A now. I don't see chat, so I don't see any questions, but Hillary, maybe you could field them for me, or I could.
Yeah,
somebody
so
could just.
Yes, I would be happy to field some Q&A. Before we got to Q&A, just wanted to really quickly introduce our Director of Development, Chris Konish, who I'm just going to put on for a minute. because he is just going to connect a little bit of our work with Alaska Wilderness League and the area that your book is about, which is the Tongass, and just talk briefly about how those two things are connected. And I'll let you take it away, Chris, before we start Q&A.
Thanks, Hillary, and thanks, Kim, for being with us. I had a great opportunity to see you in person in St. Louis way back when, and that was a great experience. And these have been some fantastic stories you've shared tonight. In the spirit of storytelling, I'm not going to share my screen or anything and show the same PowerPoint many of you have likely seen, but I'm very pleased to share that not only Kim, but thousands of others have stood up for issues, including protecting areas like the Tongass National Forest in Southeast Alaska, which the League has fought to protect for decades. It's an area that we're still committed to defending and protecting. We're fortunate to see some really good progress and gains with the restoration of the roadless rule and a lot of pledges by the Biden administration towards ending old growth clear cuts, but there's still work to be done. So supporting organizations like Alaska Wilderness League, getting engaged, taking action are great opportunities. And you can always, if you've signed up for this event, you'll be getting emails from us, and we encourage you to make sure that you participate in these public processes to make sure your voices is heard and contribute to ensure that folks on our dedicated team are able to keep their eye on policies and ensure that no treacherous old growth clear cuts can continue, as well as making sure that protections are strong. The Alaska Wilderness League is now 30 years this year, which is incredible to think of. Kim stumbled on an old picture from way back yonder on a sailboat where I saw your familiar face today in the league office, which was fun. We've been working with folks like him and others throughout our history, and we're looking forward to ensuring that people cannot sneak in any wrongdoings for Alaska's public lands and waters, whether in Southeast Alaska or up in Alaska's Arctic, where we're still in active litigation fighting the Willow Project, which many of you have likely heard about, and still continuing to fight to ensure that no drill rigs will tarnish the Arctic Refuge coastal plain, which to this day remains untouched. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I encourage you again to continue to keep an eye on your emails. Go to alaskawild.org. There's a great donate button that I always encourage folks to check out. And we love thanking our supporters and ensuring that you are up to speed and want to make ourselves available for questions. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. If anything in this presentation piques your interest, or if you have questions generally about the league's issue, I always love setting up Zoom calls, getting on the phone. If you're in the DC area, I'm happy to make a trek and say hello, or if I'm in your neck of the woods, happy to connect. And thanks all again, and I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see you. And yeah, we'll kick off some Q&A. I see a lot of excitement around Protecting Wild Alaska in the chat here. One of the first questions that is, well, one of the closest questions right now is wanting to hear a little bit about your opinion writing for The Guardian, who the audience is that you're targeting there, and how would you maybe what this sparks in me is kind of, what do you think is more effective in changing behavior? Is it opinion pieces, or is it fiction? Or tell us a little bit about your different audiences and how that's working.
Right. Well, I think to really make deep fundamental change, it's called movement theory, and you need many different people working in many different fronts. Storytelling, developing good science, activism, running for political office. So I think you need to really affect powerful change. You need people of all kinds of talents and skills working together, doing what they do best. Storytellers telling stories, and scientists doing very good work, and on all fronts. So I do write stories, I write books, but I also do write opinion pieces in The Guardian, which are very different from my novels. So I was a nonfiction writer for many years, and I broke into the Los Angeles Times in the 1980s because I met a fellow that worked for the New Yorker in the Galapagos Islands, and we became friends. And he had a friend who was the editorial page editor at the LA Times, and he said, you should contact this guy. So I got a break. It's just who you know, right? So I thought, writing opinions, what's that? So I started studying them. And I would land an opinion with the LA Times every 2 or 3 years throughout the 1980s. And I broke into the Guardian in 2017. So the Guardian, very briefly, everybody, was founded in Manchester in 1821. It moved to London in 1959, where in the UK, the Guardian is print and now digital. And then in 2011, the Guardian moved to the United States with an office in New York City. It's where it's digital only in the US. And I broke in 2017 through the Alaska Wilderness League. I would write pieces for the AWL and they would shop them around. And Gwen, what was Gwen's last name? Gwen
Dobbs.
Anyway, Gwen Dobbs landed that for me in late 2017 on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And again, another piece of mine on the Tongass National Forest in the spring of 2018. And since then, I developed a relationship with the editors at The Guardian. And since then, The Guardian US must be 10 times bigger now, readership, than it had back then, just in 2017, and has no paywall. So anybody can read The Guardian, and they ask for donations. So it's important for a couple of reasons. It's how many people are reading it, but also it's who's reading it. So I know, for example, that Jill Biden reads The Guardian, that Michelle Obama reads The Guardian. Very powerful people read The Guardian assiduously. And it's saying that The Guardian is saying things that not a whole lot of other news outlets are saying about biodiversity loss, population control, gun control, climate crisis. They're just going there. And I was inspired to write for The Guardian by the work of George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian UK. George Monbiot. And he would just write about the insanity of consumerism, but he would do it in a very clever, beautiful way. And so there you go. And so I've written about wolves, a couple pieces for The Guardian on wolves, about the persecution of wolves in Idaho and Wisconsin and in the greater Yellowstone area and southwest Montana, and write about the importance of wolves. Yeah, so it's intense. You get strong responses and lots of praise too. It's very high profile. I can't quite believe that I write for The Guardian. I take it very seriously. It takes a lot of research, but it's an honor. So anyway, it's good.
Speaking of research, one of the questions I was going to follow up with was just around both these articles that you've written in The Guardian about wolves, but also overall for your book. Can you talk with us a little bit about kind of what research you did to learn more about the salmon-eating wolves and what you learned about them that particularly sparked your imagination, or any other research that you did that you think we would find interesting?
Right, I just read about Southeast Alaska wolves and everything I can find, science journals and the work that's being done, conservation newsletters, newspapers, etc., magazines. But what really did it for me was reading Beyond Words by Carl Safina, where he really goes in and talks about the emotional intelligence of certain animals that have been studied at length: orca, wolves, elephants, etc. Those three primarily. And then reading Brian Doyle's book, his novel, Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N, M-A-R-T-E-N, about a martin named Martin, a magnificent novel that won the John Burroughs Medal, which is a prize given to books for excellence in writing about the natural world. And only twice, I believe, have works of fiction won that award, the John Burroughs Medal. I think The Snow Leopard by Peter Mathiasson and Martin by Brian Doyle. So reading Martin by Brian Doyle, a novel, from the point of view of a martin, and then reading Beyond Words, a non-fiction book by a very good science writer named Carl Safina, gave me the courage to write from a wolf's point of view. And then at the beginning of the book, I write sort of an author's note, I say this story in part is about wolves. And while I cannot occupy the mind of a wolf or embed myself in a pack, I can avail myself of many excellent sources that tell me much. We now understand wolves far better than we did 50 to 100 years ago. With each new observation and study, we gain more certainty that wolves, elephants, orcas, octopuses, and other animals occupy much of the same emotional and intellectual landscape that humans do. With this in mind, I have taken literary license to create wolves that possess the compassion and brotherhood they deserve.
Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. And I know that many of our listeners and supporters who are not on this episode really care about wolves very deeply. And so I'm sure that resonates with them as well. Another follow-up question around kind of research is, do the people who live in Gustavus, am I pronouncing that correctly, Gustavus? Do they ever recognize themselves in your book? And do you feel like your sort of exploration of that area went to the level where you have individual people that you're thinking of?
People are always intrigued by that, of course, right? They read a book and want to know if, especially if they're familiar with the area, they try to find characters or places they're familiar with. So of course, yes, I do. Often when I create characters in a book, I create an amalgam. I take traits from this person, traits from that person, and traits from a third or fourth person, and I put them all together in a single character in the book. And for places, I use what's really there. I just give it different names. So Pleasant Island out in Icy Strait, I called Archibald Island, and the Good River right over here to the west of me, I call Menzies River. Archibald Menzies was the medical doctor and the naturalist that sailed with George Vancouver into Alaska in 1794. So I just named an island. I just took an existing island and an existing river and changed their names. And I changed Gustavus to Strawberry Flats. Right? There comes a point when you're writing fiction and you're coming down from a cosmic view. You're coming down. There's Earth. Where you're going to call Earth, Earth. Yes. Okay. You're going to call Alaska, Alaska. Yeah. Here we come down, down, down. We're going to call Icy Strait, Icy Strait. Okay. Yes. Am I going to call Gustavus, Gustavus? If I do, then am I going to call this particular business the actual business that it is, or I'm going to have the business on that street and change the business name? So at some point, the author has to decide, at what level do you start fictionalizing geographic features? And that's always a tricky thing, right? Does that end? I think that hopefully answers your question. And is there a hill? I see Nancy Lur just wrote in, is there a hill like Heaven's Hill near Gustavus? No, Nancy, it's a all flat, and I created that hill. That hill, I made that hill an erosional feature. So it was carved and shaped. It's left over from the glaciers, carved away and took the rest of it away. Whereas all the flats around it are a depositional feature, which is the outwash river off the Great Glacier that once filled Glacier Bay or Crystal Bay and built Gustavus, or the town of Strawberry Flats, upon which Strawberry Flats exist. But in real life, there is no Heaven's Hill.
Okay, let's see other questions. I am going up to the top, and I'm not immediately find another question, but I actually had a follow-up question to you alluding to the intensity of the responses to some of the things you've written about wolves. And I'm curious if in these years that you've been part of this space, where do you see hope for seeing eye to eye in some of these tough issues like that?
I like what Greta
ground.
Thunberg's Right. I like what Greta Thunberg's observation. She's a remarkable observation for a woman of her age. She's really pretty astounding gal. So she says that once you become an activist and you get involved, you see hope everywhere. But if you're not, if you're just paralyzed by the times and the moment, which is easy to be because it can be overwhelming where we find ourselves today, then it can be very hard to find hope. And Jane Goodall says the same thing. If you've not read Jane Goodall's recent book on hope, I recommend it to everybody. So hope is very different from optimism. Hope's not necessarily rational. But I like to think of the future as just a series of presents, and we just move from one present to a next to build a better future. The future we live in now was unthinkable a couple hundred years ago, for better or for worse, but it's unthinkable. So I always try to tell myself that there's a future out there that could be vastly better than any of us can really imagine right now or really think possible, right? And it's exciting. It's exciting to be a part of building that future, right? I like to think of the whole idea of golden opportunities mask themselves as insurmountable obstacles. Whoa. And the whole thing, Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison, writing in prison out on an island off of South Africa, writing, it always seems impossible until it is done. So I think I feel privileged to be alive in a free country, to have the wherewithal to express myself through words, and to be able to hold in my hand a device that contains a vast amount of knowledge, and that I have the community of people that support me. Nancy Lord just wrote a really nice review of On Heaven's Hill in the Anchorage Daily News. Thank you, Nancy. Thank goodness Alaska has David James and Nancy Lord writing these book reviews, keeping books alive in Alaska. So really, it's good, I think, to maybe mix things up and try to shake yourself free of the bounds that maybe that the prison or the jail cells we might be carrying around within us, and maybe confer with people who love you and you love them, to really get good advice on what to do if you're feeling a lot of despair. And then confronting people who see the world differently than we do, Hillary, like you asked. I like to say that to disarm them with kindness. Just walk away. If it becomes very unsavory, just walk away. I grew up with the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and I saw how things like that can shatter families and shatter relationships. And it's tough. It's not a weakness if it happens to you or to your family. It's not that you were weak. I don't think. It's just overwhelming. Human beings are so terribly complex, but I just think kindness and stories. Once again, I confronted a climate change denier once on the dock in Glacier Bay, which is just 8 miles from where I live in Gustavus. And we were talking along, and he was kind of expressing his doubts. And I said to him, John, can I tell you a story? And he went, you could just see his whole posture change. He went, sure. He just opened up. You could just see the gates to his heart open up. I now had his full attention and his full, maybe not compassion, but he was opening himself to me, because I said, hey, you want to hear a story? It's powerful. It's awesome. So, yeah.
That actually connects perfectly with one of the follow-up questions to a previous comment that you made, which is, how do you decide when you're going to tell a story as a novel versus as a memoir versus as an opinion piece? Like, what do you do to decide that?
Well, it's all part of just singing my song. I often write with my guitar in my lap, and because music, I'm a musician, and so it really helps to get the juices going. But it's all almost, Hillary, like writing a song versus, I don't want to compare myself like I'm a composer, but writing a novel is like writing a symphony. You know, I remember when Chopin, Frederick Chopin, played for George Sand, a woman, his partner, in Paris once. He finished a brand new etude, and he played it in 2 minutes. And she said, "Why does your music move me so?" And he thought for a moment. Chopin thought for a moment. He said, "Perhaps because the length is in exact proportion to the content." So if there's something I want to say, and there's always something I want to say, and I always am trying to write to not just to be a parrot, just to talk because I can. I don't want to write to say something. I want to write because I have something to say. And I want that something to always be in service to building a better world, making a better world. I know that sounds highbrow, but it's where I'm at. I'm 71 years old, and it's where I'm at now. I grew up with Vietnam and the civil rights, and it's just how I was raised in America. So I'll think, okay, right now I'm thinking of the drought in the desert Southwest with the Colorado River. The Lake Mead is probably going to hit dead pool. They expect, even with the heavy snowfall this last winter, probably in the end of 2025. That means 40 million people could be largely out of water, out of power, and out of agricultural water. All that's stunning to me. So that's something I'd write in the Guardian. That's not something I'd write a novel about. That's something I've already written one piece about it in the Guardian in 2021, and I used John Wesley Powell, and I invoked Wallace Stegner, who came up with the term the geography of hope in this Alaska Wilderness League series, the great dean of Western writers, Wallace Stegner. But you can find that piece I wrote for the Guardian in 2021 on the drought in the desert Southwest. Because John Wesley Powell wrote a piece in 1878, basically saying, he worked for the government then, he was an ethnographer. If we're going to settle in the desert Southwest, we better do it lightly, because this is unforgiving country. I mean, that the lack of water defines everything. Well, of course, nobody listened to him. So I used that as an introduction. But something like that, that's an exact thing I would use for a Guardian piece. Whereas something much more in depth about community, or about a longer piece, not an etude or a waltz, but maybe more like a trilogy or more like a symphony, I'd say that's going to involve creating characters and watching the transformation in these characters. The best way to get through on this issue is to create a transformational situation for different characters. So then I would work on a novel, which takes me a long time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I know that you wanted to say a few closing words at the end of our hour today. Is this a good place to maybe close? I feel like we've gotten through. Oh, no, sorry. One last comment. One person has asked if you have other books about Southeast Alaska that you would recommend. And then maybe you can answer that and close.
Yes, other books about Southeast Alaska, I would recommend The Island Within by Richard Nelson. Faith of Cranes by Hank Lentfer. The Blue Bear by Lynn Schooler. There you go. There's 3. I hope that helps everybody. And a remarkable book by a teenage girl, my neighbor, Hold the Tide by Linnea Lentfer. Amazing. She started it when she was 12, finished it when she was 17. It's a pretty outrageous novel. Hold the Tide. Yeah,
Thank you.
She's a sophomore at Carleton College now in Minnesota, and she just led a campaign to convince the college to divest from fossil fuels. She's an amazing kid. She's 19 years old. So let me read everybody from the ending of On Heaven's Hill without giving anything away, but just here's Kess. Now it's 3 years after the book opens. She's really dug in deep to Alaska. She's somebody she never thought she could be in Texas. And she says, as pastel evening light plays over the rooftops and the trees and the fireweed seeds drifting about, catching the last light breaking, it occurs to Kess that you have to invent words for the way beauty expresses itself in Alaska. And then later, as for fishing, Uncle Ty says, well, they'll long line in Chatham Strait. It'll be hard work, Kess, but we'll also poke around the north shore of Chichagof Island to study coastal brownies and humpback whales and sea otters. And after that, well, who knows? We might head up into Crystal Bay for a couple days and anchor in rock-ribbed inlets and hang out with harbor seals, kittiwakes, and tidewater glaciers, sing with loons, dance with storms, put glacial ice in our drinks, and slurp down the Pleistocene. How does that sound? That night, Kess was so excited. She jammed with Papa until 1 o'clock in the morning and talked about family in Mexico, her birth mom's family, my family, and heard so many life-affirming stories from Papa that afterwards she could hardly sleep. Slurping down the Pleistocene, slurping down the Ice Age. Wow. When she told Uncle Ty the next day, he chuckled, it all used to be under one big glacier, my young apprentice, an icy sarcophagus. And now look how alive the land is, with wild strawberries growing out of solid granite and moose swimming fjords and wolves crossing ice fields. It's a land and sea of rebirth, a Renaissance place. And if you stay here long enough and let it speak to you and learn to listen, you'll be reborn too.
Thank you so much for that closing. And thank you for coming to speak with us tonight, Kim. This is so interesting and just great to hear from a writer's perspective on Alaska. Everyone, thanks for coming and joining us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and hope to see you again soon for our next Geography of Hope. Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.